You've found the Stealth Podcast. Where are you watching from? What time is it there? Subscribe and comment to support us. Thanks. Let's begin. What I'm about to tell you happened during what should have been a routine winter camping trip near Jasper. I thought I was prepared for anything the Canadian wilderness could throw at me, but I was dead wrong. The blizzard that trapped me wasn't the real danger. It was what the storm brought with it. Some things hunt in the cold, and they're patient enough to wait for the perfect moment when you're completely cut off from the outside world. I'm Elena Vasquez, 31 years old, and I've been living in Vancouver for about 6 years now, working as a freelance photographer. My converted Chevy Express has been my mobile studio and home away from home for the better part of 2 years. Unlike most Vanlifers, I actually prefer winter camping, fewer crowds, incredible landscapes, and the kind of solitude you can't find during tourist season. My girlfriend Sarah Chun, who's 29 and works in tech, thinks I'm completely insane for choosing to camp in sub-zero temperatures, but she supports my crazy adventures from the warmth of our downtown apartment. This particular trip was supposed to be a solo photography expedition to capture the northern lights around Jasper National Park. I'd been planning it for months, studying weather patterns and aurora forecasts, upgrading my van's insulation and heating system specifically for this journey. The route from Vancouver to Jasper was familiar territory. I'd driven it dozens of times, but never in the dead of January when temperatures regularly dropped below -30°C. Most people thought I was disturbing for attempting it alone, but I'd done my homework and prepared extensively. My van was equipped with everything I thought I'd need: a diesel heater, extra batteries, emergency food supplies, and communication equipment that should work even in remote areas. I'd even installed a satellite phone as backup, something Sarah insisted on after hearing too many horror stories about people getting stranded in the wilderness. The weather forecast showed a clear window for the next 4 days, perfect conditions for both driving and aurora photography. What could possibly go wrong? The first sign that this trip might not go according to plan came about 3 hours outside of Kamloops. The radio started picking up emergency weather alerts, something about an unexpected Arctic front moving down from the north much faster than meteorologists had predicted. I probably should have turned around right then, but I was already committed, and the photographer in me was excited by the possibility of capturing a storm. Bad weather often creates the most dramatic and memorable shots. I pushed forward, telling myself I could always find shelter in one of the small towns along the highway if things got too scary. The temperature gauge in my van showed it dropping steadily, -15, -20, -25. Snow started falling around sunset, light flakes at first, then heavier until my wipers were struggling to keep the windshield clear. By the time I reached my planned camping spot, a secluded area about 20 kilometers off the main highway, the world had transformed into a white, swirling nightmare that would change everything. The blizzard hit with a ferocity that made me question every decision I'd made in the last 24 hours. Within an hour of parking, my van was completely surrounded by snowdrifts that reached halfway up the windows. The wind howled like something alive and angry, rocking the vehicle so violently I had to brace myself against the walls just to stay upright. My satellite phone showed no signal. Apparently, even military-grade communication equipment had limits when faced with this kind of weather. The scary realization hit me that I was truly, completely alone. My diesel heater was working overtime, but I could feel the cold seeping through every gap and seal in the van's construction. Frost started forming on the inside of the windows despite the heater running constantly, and I began to worry about carbon monoxide buildup if I kept it going all night. The storm showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse. Weather reports on my emergency radio spoke of unprecedented conditions and advised all travelers to seek immediate shelter. Too late for that advice now. That's when I started hearing things that couldn't possibly be real. At first, I thought it was just the wind creating weird acoustics around the van, but these sounds were too structured, too purposeful. Scratching noises that moved in deliberate patterns across the roof and walls, like something with claws was systematically exploring every inch of my shelter. Then came the tapping, not random, but rhythmic, almost like Morse code. 3 short taps, 3 long ones, 3 short again. SOS. Something was asking for help, but that made no sense. I tried to convince myself it was just debris blown by the wind, maybe branches or ice chunks hitting the van's exterior. But deep down, I knew better. The sounds were too organized, too intelligent. When I pressed my ear against the wall to listen more carefully, I could swear I heard breathing on the other side, slow, deliberate respirations that definitely didn't belong to any animal I knew. My photography equipment registered temperature readings that didn't match what my heater was producing, showing cold spots that moved around the van's perimeter like something was absorbing heat from outside. The most disturbing part was how my dog Pixel was reacting to all this. I'd brought my 3-year-old husky Mix along for company, and she was usually fearless around wildlife and weather. But now she was cowering in the far corner of the van, whimpering and refusing to go near any of the windows. Every few minutes, she'd growl at something I couldn't see, her hackles raised and her body trembling with fear. Dogs have senses we don't, and whatever Pixel was detecting out there in the storm was scaring her more than I'd ever seen before. Around midnight, the scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by something infinitely worse: complete silence. Even the howling wind seemed to die down, creating an unnatural quiet that made my ears ring. Pixel's whimpering grew more frantic, and she started pawing at the van's floor as if trying to dig her way out. That's when I saw the first clear sign that we weren't dealing with normal weather or wildlife. Handprints were appearing in the frost on my windows, not from the inside, but pressed against the glass from outside, each one perfectly formed despite the sub-zero temperatures. The prints were wrong in every possible way. Too large to be human, with fingers that extended far beyond normal proportions, and they left behind a residue that glowed faintly in the dark. As I watched in horror, more prints appeared, higher up on the windows than any person could reach, even standing on something. Whatever was out there was tall, unnaturally tall, and it was taking its time examining my van from every angle. The scary part was how methodical it seemed. This wasn't random animal behavior, but something with intelligence and purpose. My camera equipment started malfunctioning in ways I'd never experienced before. Digital displays flickered with interference patterns, and my expensive lenses began fogging up despite being in a climate-controlled environment. When I tried to take pictures of the handprints, my camera's LCD screen showed things that weren't visible to my naked eye: shadowy figures standing around the van, too many to count, all impossibly tall and thin. The images lasted only seconds before corrupting into static, but those brief glimpses revealed a truth more disturbing than I was prepared to handle. The temperature inside the van began dropping despite my heater running at maximum capacity. I could see my breath forming clouds, and ice started forming on every metal surface. But this wasn't normal cold. It felt malevolent, like something was actively draining warmth from my shelter. Pixel's water bowl froze solid in minutes, and I realized that whatever was outside wasn't just surviving in these conditions, it was controlling them. The blizzard wasn't a natural weather event, it was a hunting tool. That's when I heard the voices, muffled by wind and snow, but definitely human speech coming from multiple directions around the van. They were calling my name, which should have been impossible since no one knew exactly where I was. "Elena," they whispered, "we've been waiting for you. Come outside. It's warmer out here." The voices belonged to people I recognized: Sarah, my parents, friends from Vancouver, but I knew with absolute certainty that none of them were actually there. Something was using their voices to lure me out into the storm, and the scary realization hit me that it knew exactly who I was and how to manipulate me. The fake voices grew more insistent and desperate, pleading with me to open the door and join them in the warmth outside. But I could see through the frosted windows that there was nothing warm about the world beyond my van. Just howling wind, driving snow, and those impossibly tall shadows moving between the trees. When I refused to respond to the familiar voices, they changed tactics, becoming angry and accusatory. "Why won't you help us, Elena? We're freezing out here because of you. This is all your fault." The psychological manipulation was terrifying in its effectiveness. Pixel suddenly bolted toward the van's rear doors, barking frantically at something I couldn't see. Through the small window, I caught a glimpse of what had spooked her, a face pressed against the glass, but not quite human. The features were stretched and distorted, like someone had taken a person's face and pulled it in all directions until it barely resembled anything recognizable. Worst of all, It was smiling at me with too many teeth, and its eyes reflected light like an animal's. When I blinked, it was gone, but the frost on the window now bore the outline of its impossible features. My van's electrical system started failing in cascading waves. First, the interior lights flickered and died. Then the heaters sputtered to a halt, finally leaving me in complete darkness with nothing but my phone's flashlight and rapidly draining battery power. The cold rushed in immediately, and I realized I had maybe an hour before hypothermia became a real threat. But going outside meant facing whatever was hunting me in the storm. I grabbed my emergency gear, sleeping bag, hand warmers, emergency flares, and made the scary decision to try reaching my van's emergency radio in the driver's cab. The moment I moved toward the front of the van, something heavy landed on the roof with an impact that shook the entire vehicle. Footsteps, if you could call them that, walked back and forth above my head, accompanied by a scratching sound like claws or fingernails dragging across metal. Then came a new sound that made my blood freeze. Laughter. Not human laughter, but something that had learned to mimic the sound without understanding what it meant. It was coming from directly above me, and getting louder. I grabbed one of my emergency flares and pulled the ignition cord. Brilliant red light flooded the van's interior, and immediately the sounds above me stopped. Whatever was up there didn't like the light, or maybe it was the sulfur smell, but I heard it scramble away with surprising speed. The flare bought me maybe 10 minutes of relative safety, but I had limited supplies and no guarantee they'd continue to be effective. I had to make a choice: stay in the van and freeze to death when my flares ran out, or make a run for the main highway and hope I could outrun whatever was hunting me in this horror-filled winter nightmare. I made what I thought was the smart choice, staying with the van and rationing my flares until the storm passed. For 3 days, I played a deadly game of cat and mouse with whatever was outside, using light and fire to keep the creatures at bay while conserving body heat and water. Pixel and I huddled together in my sleeping bag, sharing warmth and fear in equal measure. The voices continued their psychological assault, cycling through everyone I'd ever cared about, but I'd learned to ignore them. What I couldn't ignore was how my supplies were dwindling and my strength was fading. On the 4th morning, the storm finally broke. Brilliant sunshine flooded through my frosted windows, and for the first time in days, I heard normal sounds: wind through trees, birds calling, the ordinary music of a living forest. Whatever had been stalking me seemed to have vanished with the darkness, leaving behind only strange indentations in the snow around my van and a lingering smell like sulfur and decay. I managed to get my engine started and carefully navigated back to the main highway, convinced I'd survived the worst experience of my life. But I was wrong about being safe. The things that hunted me in that blizzard had marked me somehow, left their scent on me like a tracking beacon. Over the following weeks, I started noticing them in Vancouver, tall shadows in my peripheral vision, familiar voices calling my name from empty alleyways, handprints appearing on my apartment windows despite being on the 15th floor. Sarah thought I was having a breakdown from the trauma, and maybe I was, but that didn't make the signs any less real or scary. The breaking point came exactly 1 month after my return. I woke up to find Pixel missing from our apartment, with no sign of forced entry and all doors still locked from the inside. Security cameras showed nothing unusual, but I found her collar on the building's roof, covered in that same glowing residue I'd seen on my van windows. That night, I heard her barking somewhere far below, in what sounded like underground tunnels or caves. She was alive, but trapped, and I knew exactly what had taken her. They're still out there, waiting for me to come back and finish what we started in that storm. Every winter night, when the temperature drops and snow starts falling in Vancouver, I hear them calling. Not with stolen voices anymore, but with Pixel's bark, pleading and desperate. They know I can't resist that sound forever, that eventually my love for her will overcome my fear of them. And they're right. I've already bought new winter gear and started planning my return trip to Jasper. Some mistakes you make once, and some you make until they kill you. I know which category this one falls into, but I'm going anyway. I'm about to tell you about the worst mistake I ever made in my van. What started as a simple overnight stop near Banff turned into a nightmare that still keeps me awake. I thought I was being smart, parking in that secluded spot by the lake, but some places are empty for a reason. The locals had stories about that area, stories I should have listened to. What I experienced that night changed everything I thought I knew about being alone in the wilderness. I'm Marcus Delacroix, 43 years old, and I've been calling Montreal home for the past 15 years. My van's been my escape from the city chaos for about 3 years now, a converted 2018 Ford Transit that I've turned into my mobile sanctuary. My buddy Jake Thornfield, who's 38 and works construction back in Montreal, was supposed to join me on this trip to the Canadian Rockies, but his job held him back at the last minute. So here I was, driving solo toward Banff National Park, something that felt both liberating and slightly unsettling. The drive from Montreal had been brutal, nearly 40 hours of highway, truck stops, and cheap coffee. My back was screaming, and the van's engine had started making this weird rattling sound somewhere around Thunder Bay. But man, when those mountain peaks started appearing on the horizon, all that road fatigue just melted away. There's something deeply disturbing about how small you feel when you're surrounded by those massive rock formations, like nature's reminding you of your place in the world. I'd planned this trip for months, mapping out spots where I could park overnight without getting hassled by park rangers or local cops. Stealth camping's an art form. Really, you gotta know where to hide in plain sight. The official campgrounds were all booked solid, typical for peak season, but I'd found this perfect little spot on some forums. A hidden pull-off near Moraine Lake, tucked away from the main tourist routes where most people wouldn't even notice you. The weather had been perfect all week. Clear skies, mild temperatures, the kind of conditions that make you feel invincible. But as I got closer to my destination, something felt off. Maybe it was the way the locals at the last gas station looked at me when I mentioned where I was headed, or how the guy behind the counter just shook his head and muttered something under his breath. A lot of stories about that area, he'd said, but when I pressed him for details, he just changed the subject. By the time I reached the turnoff, the sun was already setting behind the mountains, casting these long, eerie shadows across the road. The GPS signal kept cutting out, which wasn't unusual in the mountains, but it added to this growing sense of unease. I could hear my heart beating faster as I navigated the narrow dirt path leading to my chosen spot. The trees seemed to close in around the van, and I caught myself checking the rearview mirror more often than usual, though I couldn't explain why. The spot I'd found online looked perfect in daylight photos, but arriving at dusk painted a completely different picture. The small clearing sat maybe 50 yards from the lake, surrounded by dense pine trees that seemed to swallow up any remaining light. My van's headlights cut through the growing darkness, illuminating what looked like the remnants of old campsites. Fire rings filled with ash, scattered beer cans, and something that made my stomach turn. Deep scratches carved into several tree trunks, too high and too deliberate to be from animals. I'd barely put the van in park when my phone lost all signal bars. Not unusual for the mountains, but the timing felt wrong somehow. The silence out here was disturbing in a way I'd never experienced before. No birds, no insects, not even the usual rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Just this heavy, oppressive quiet that seemed to press against my eardrums. I tried starting up my portable radio to catch some local stations, but all I got was static mixed with what sounded like distant voices speaking in a language I couldn't identify. The rational part of my brain kept telling me to just drive back to town and find a motel, but I'd come too far and spent too much gas money to turn back now. Besides, I dealt with creepy camping spots before. Sometimes your imagination just runs wild when you're alone in unfamiliar territory. I started my usual evening routine, leveling the van, setting up my interior lights, and heating up some canned soup on my little camp stove. Normal activities that should have made me feel better, but somehow made everything feel more scary. That's when I noticed the smell. At first, I thought maybe it was just stagnant lake water or decomposing leaves, but this was different. Sweet and sickly, like something had died nearby and been left to rot in the humid air. I grabbed my flashlight and did a quick perimeter check around the van, trying to locate the source. What I found instead were more of those deep scratches on trees, forming rough circles around my parking spot. Some looked fresh, the wood still pale and bleeding sap. As I climbed back into the van and locked the doors, I caught something in my peripheral vision, a flash of movement near the tree line. When I turned my flashlight toward it, nothing was there except shadows dancing in the beam. but I could swear I'd seen something tall and pale disappearing behind the pines. My hands started shaking as I double-checked all the locks and pulled the curtains closed. Maybe that gas station clerk had been trying to warn me about something after all. Sleep came in restless waves, interrupted by sounds I couldn't quite identify. Around 2 a.m., I woke to what sounded like someone, or something, slowly circling the van. Footsteps in the gravel, deliberate and measured, stopping every few seconds as if listening. My heart hammered against my ribs as I lay perfectly still, afraid that even the slightest movement might give away that I was awake. The steps continued their circuit for what felt like hours, accompanied by a low humming that seemed to vibrate through the van's walls. When morning finally came, I found handprints pressed against my windows, dozens of them, all different sizes, some so small they could have belonged to children. But the disturbing part wasn't their size, it was how they were positioned. Too high up on the glass, as if whoever made them had been stretched unnaturally tall or floating. I tried wiping them away, but they seemed to be on the inside of the glass somehow, which was impossible since I'd been locked in all night. My rational mind scrambled for explanations while my gut screamed at me to get the hell out of there. The van wouldn't start. I turned the key again and again, hearing nothing but clicking sounds from under the hood. The battery had been fine yesterday, and I'd been religious about maintaining the electrical system. But now, when I needed it most, everything was dead. Even my phone, which I'd charged overnight, showed zero battery despite being plugged in all night. It was like something had drained every bit of power from my mobile sanctuary, leaving me stranded in this increasingly horror-filled situation. That's when I saw her. A woman in a tattered white dress, standing at the edge of the clearing about 30 feet away. She was perfectly still, facing my van, and even from that distance I could see that something was fundamentally wrong with her appearance. Her limbs seemed too long, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, and when she raised one arm to point directly at me, her fingers extended far beyond what should have been humanly possible. I blinked hard, convinced I was hallucinating from stress and lack of sleep. But when I opened my eyes, she was closer. Not walking closer, just closer, as if she'd somehow compressed the space between us. Now I could see her face, or what remained of it. Hollow eye sockets leaked something dark down her cheeks, and her mouth hung open in a silent scream that revealed too many teeth. She raised that impossibly long arm again, and this time I heard her voice despite the distance, a whisper that seemed to come from inside my own head, repeating the same phrase over and over. "You shouldn't have come here." Pure terror finally broke through my paralysis, and I threw myself at the van's controls, frantically trying everything I could think of. I pumped the gas pedal, turned the key until my wrist ached, even tried push-starting it by rolling downhill, but nothing worked. The woman in white had vanished, but I could feel her presence everywhere now, in the shadows between trees, in the unnatural silence, in the way the air itself seemed to thicken around me. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed it with water and energy bars, and made the scary decision to abandon my van and hike back to the main road. The moment I stepped outside, the temperature dropped at least 20 degrees. My breath came out in visible puffs despite it being mid-July, and frost was actually forming on the van's windows as I watched. Something was very, very wrong with this place, and every instinct I had screamed at me to run. I started jogging toward what I hoped was the trail back to the road, my flashlight beam dancing wildly as I stumbled over roots and rocks. Behind me, I could hear the van's metal creaking and groaning, as if something massive was climbing on top of it. I'd barely made it 100 yards when I realized I wasn't alone in the woods. Shapes moved between the trees, keeping pace with me but staying just outside my flashlight's reach. They were too tall to be human, moving with that same unnatural gait I'd seen from the woman. Whispers followed me through the darkness, not wind through leaves, but actual voices speaking in that same unknown language I'd heard on the radio. The scary part was that somehow, on some primal level, I was beginning to understand what they were saying. Stay with us. Join us. You belong here now. My jog turned into a full sprint as panic took complete control. Branches whipped at my face, roots tried to trip me, and I swear the path kept changing direction when I wasn't looking directly at it. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel cold breath on the back of my neck despite seeing nothing when I spun around. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving me stumbling through complete darkness, guided only by moonlight filtering through the canopy above. Every shadow looked like reaching hands. Every tree trunk resembled a waiting figure. Then I saw headlights ahead, real, blessed, normal headlights cutting through the forest gloom. A pickup truck was parked at what looked like the main trailhead, engine running, driver's door open. I screamed for help as I burst from the tree lean, waving my arms frantically. The driver, an older man in flannel, took one look at my terrified face and shouted, "Get in." Now, I didn't need to be told twice. As we peeled out onto the paved road, I caught a glimpse in the side mirror of pale figures emerging from the woods, watching us leave with those hollow, dark eyes. The driver, who introduced himself as Bill, was a local park ranger who'd been doing late-night patrols after receiving reports of missing campers in that area. "You're the third person this month I've pulled out of those woods," he told me, his hands shaking slightly on the steering wheel. "The others, they weren't as lucky as you." He explained that the area around that particular lake had a long history of disappearances, going back to when the First Nations people still lived in the region. They'd considered it cursed ground, a place where the boundary between worlds was thin and dangerous. Bill drove me to the nearest town, a small place called Canmore, where I spent the rest of the night in a cheap motel room with all the lights on. I tried calling Jake to tell him what happened, but how do you explain something like that without sounding completely insane? Instead, I just told him I'd had van trouble and would be heading home early. The local police were sympathetic but not particularly surprised when I reported my abandoned vehicle. "We'll send someone to check on it," the officer said, but his tone suggested they'd probably find nothing but an empty clearing. 3 days later, I got a call from that same police department. They'd found my van, all right, but not in the condition I'd left it. The entire vehicle had been stripped down to its frame, every piece of metal bent and twisted into impossible shapes, as if something with incredible strength had methodically torn it apart. What disturbed the investigators most was that all the pieces were arranged in perfect geometric patterns around the clearing, patterns that matched ancient symbols found in local cave paintings. No human could have done that kind of work, especially not in complete silence. The insurance company fought the claim for months, insisting that no natural disaster could have caused that kind of systematic destruction. They sent their own investigators, who came back with reports that contradicted basic physics and left them more confused than when they started. Eventually, they paid out just to close the file, but I could tell they thought I was running some kind of elaborate scam. If only they knew how much I wished that were true, how much I wanted this whole experience to be something I'd made up for money. I never went back to Vanlife after that. Hell, I barely leave Montreal anymore unless I absolutely have to. Sometimes, late at night when I'm trying to sleep, I still hear those whispers in that unknown language, and I catch myself understanding more and more of what they're saying. They're still calling to me, telling me I left something important behind in those woods. Part of me, a scary, growing part of me, wants to go back and find out what they mean. But I know that if I ever return to that cursed place by the lake, I won't be coming back home again. I need to tell someone about what happened to us near Thunder Bay last summer. What started as a perfect couple's retreat in our van turned into something that still makes me question my own sanity. We thought we'd found the ideal hidden spot by the lake, but some places stay hidden for good reasons. The locals in town had this look in their eyes when we mentioned where we were headed, like they knew something we didn't. They were right to be afraid. I'm Garrett Fleming, 52 years old, and I've been calling Winnipeg home for most of my adult life, working as an insurance adjuster. My partner Rebecca Winters is 47, a high school teacher who's originally from Ottawa, but moved to Winnipeg about 8 years ago when we got serious. We've been talking about van life for years, watching YouTube videos and dreaming about freedom on the road. But it wasn't until last spring that we finally pulled the trigger and bought a used Winnebago that we converted ourselves over several months of weekends and evenings. Rebecca's always been the adventurous one in our relationship. I'm more of a plan everything twice kind of guy, which probably comes from years of investigating insurance claims and seeing how quickly things can go wrong. But she has this infectious enthusiasm that makes even my cautious nature bend a little. When she suggested we take our maiden van voyage to the wilderness areas around Thunder Bay, I was initially hesitant. The region has a reputation for unpredictable weather and challenging terrain, not exactly ideal for beginners. Our van wasn't fancy by Instagram standards, but it had everything we needed: a comfortable bed, basic cooking facilities, solar panels for power, and most importantly, each other. We'd spent months planning this trip, researching spots where we could park overnight without bothering anyone. Rebecca had found this particular location on some obscure camping forum, a secluded area near Lake Superior where you could supposedly park right at the water's edge and wake up to incredible sunrises. The drive from Winnipeg took us through some beautiful country, but as we got closer to our destination, I noticed fewer and fewer other travelers on the roads. By the time we reached the small town nearest to our planned camping spot, we seemed to be the only outsiders around. The locals at the gas station were friendly enough, but there was something in their expressions when Rebecca mentioned the specific area we were headed to, a kind of recognition mixed with what I can only describe as concern. A lot of history around that lake, the elderly attendant told us while filling our tank. Some places are better left alone, especially after dark. When I pressed him for details, he just shook his head and changed the subject to the weather forecast. Rebecca laughed it off as small-town superstition, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was genuinely trying to warn us about something. I should have trusted that instinct and driven us straight back to Winnipeg, but hindsight's always crystal clear when you're looking back at the beginning of a horror story. The access road to our camping spot was rougher than we'd expected, barely more than 2 tire tracks through dense forest that scraped against our van's sides with every turn. Rebecca navigated while I drove, both of us getting increasingly nervous as the path seemed to go on forever without any sign of the lake. Our GPS had lost signal miles back, and the hand-drawn map from the forum was proving less reliable than we'd hoped. When we finally broke through the tree-line and saw the water, the sun was already setting, painting everything in shades of red that felt more ominous than beautiful. The camping spot itself was stunning in a disturbing kind of way. A small clearing right at the water's edge, completely isolated and surrounded by towering pines that blocked out most of the remaining daylight. We were definitely alone out here, which should have felt romantic, but instead felt exposed and vulnerable. As we set up our evening routine, I noticed things that made my insurance investigator brain start cataloging potential problems. The fire ring was filled with ash that looked recent. There were deep gouges in several nearby trees, and the silence was so complete it felt unnatural. Rebecca tried to lighten the mood by joking about the creepy factor of our chosen spot, but I could tell she was feeling it too. Our usual evening routine of cooking dinner and sharing stories felt forced and awkward in this environment. The lake itself was perfectly still, like black glass reflecting the first stars, but something about it seemed wrong. No fish jumping, no loons calling, no sound of water lapping against the shore, just absolute, unnerving quiet that made every small noise we made seem amplified and intrusive. Around 10 p.m., we started seeing lights across the lake, not electric lights, but something that looked like flickering flames moving through the trees on the far shore. Rebecca thought they might be other campers, but the lights moved in patterns that didn't make sense for people walking around a campsite. They would appear in one spot, disappear, then reappear somewhere completely different, sometimes multiple lights at once, sometimes just one. The scary part was how they seemed to be getting closer to the water's edge, as if whatever was carrying them was coming down to investigate us. We decided to call it an early night and retreated to our van, locking the doors and pulling the curtains closed. But sleep wouldn't come easily in this place. Every small sound outside, a twig snapping, leaves rustling, what might have been footsteps in the gravel, had us both lying rigid and alert. Around midnight, Rebecca grabbed my arm and whispered that she could hear voices outside, but when I listened carefully, all I heard was wind through the trees. Still, something about the way the wind sounded made it seem like it was trying to form words, trying to communicate something we weren't quite able to understand. I woke up around 3 a.m. to Rebecca shaking me frantically, her eyes wide with terror in the dim light from our battery-powered clock. "There's someone outside," she whispered, pointing toward the front of the van. "They've been walking around us for the last hour." I listened carefully and heard what she meant, deliberate footsteps circling our van, but they sounded wrong somehow. Too light for someone wearing boots, but too heavy for bare feet, and the rhythm was off, like whoever was walking had trouble coordinating their movements properly. When I peered through a gap in our front curtain, What I saw made no sense at all. A figure was indeed walking around our van, but it moved like someone who had forgotten how walking was supposed to work. Jerky, unnatural movements, arms swinging at wrong angles, head tilted too far to one side. In the moonlight, I could see it was wearing what looked like old-fashioned clothing, a long coat or dress that dragged on the ground, but the fabric seemed to move independently of any wind. Most disturbing of all, every few steps it would stop and turn toward our van, as if it knew we were watching. Rebecca pointed out that there wasn't just one figure anymore. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could make out at least 3 or 4 shapes moving between the trees around our clearing, all with that same bizarre, broken way of walking. They seemed to be communicating with each other through sounds that weren't quite human, not voices, but something like whispers mixed with static, like old radio transmissions fading in and out of range. The scary realization hit me that we were completely surrounded, with no way to drive out without going right through them. Our van's electrical system started acting up in ways I'd never experienced before. The interior lights flickered on and off randomly. Our cell phones showed full battery 1 minute and completely dead the next, and the radio began picking up signals that definitely weren't from any local stations. Voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize, mixed with what sounded like emergency broadcasts from decades ago, all overlapping into a cacophony that made my skin crawl. Even worse, occasionally I could swear I heard my own voice coming through the static, having conversations I didn't remember having. The figures outside were getting bolder, approaching closer to our van with each circuit they made around the clearing. Through the curtains, I could see them pressing their faces against our windows, leaving behind smudges that glowed faintly in the dark. But when I looked directly at the windows, there was nothing there. The faces only appeared in my peripheral vision, vanishing the moment I tried to focus on them. Rebecca was hyperventilating beside me, pointing at things I couldn't see, describing details about the figures that terrified her but remained invisible to me. Whatever was happening, it was affecting us differently, showing each of us our own personalized version of horror. By dawn, the figures had vanished, but we both knew we had to get out of there immediately. Our van started on the first try, which felt like a miracle after the electrical problems we'd experienced during the night. But as we began driving back toward the access road, I realized our nightmare was far from over. The path we'd taken to reach the lake had changed somehow. Trees had fallen across sections that were clear the day before, and the road seemed to branch off in directions that hadn't existed during our arrival. Rebecca was navigating with our backup compass, but it was spinning wildly, unable to find magnetic north in this place that seemed to exist outside normal geography. We drove for what felt like hours, following paths that should have led us back to the main highway, but instead took us deeper in a forest that grew denser and more threatening with each mile. The fuel gauge was dropping faster than it should have been, and I started to panic about running out of gas in this maze of unmarked trails and hostile wilderness. That's when we saw the other van, sitting in a small clearing about 50 yards off the main path, covered in rust and vegetation like it had been there for years. Rebecca insisted we stop to check if anyone needed help, but as we got closer, the scary truth became obvious. The van was ancient, probably from the 1970s based on its design, and completely abandoned. What made it truly disturbing was how similar it looked to ours. Same basic layout, same conversion style, even similar curtains in the windows. It was like looking at our own future, decades from now. Inside the abandoned van, we found evidence of its last occupants. Personal belongings scattered around, photographs of a couple who looked happy and excited about their adventure, and a journal with entries that described their experience in terms that matched our own terrifying night. The final entry, written in increasingly frantic handwriting, simply said, "They won't let us leave. The road keeps changing. We've been driving in circles for 3 days. If anyone finds this, don't stay here after dark. Don't trust the voices. Don't look directly at them." The date on the entry was from 1978. As we stood there reading that journal, we heard the sound of our own van's engine starting up behind us. But that was impossible. I had the keys in my pocket, and we were both standing inside the abandoned vehicle. When we ran outside, our van was indeed running, but there was no one in the driver's seat. The engine was revving on its own, and the headlights were flashing in a pattern that seemed almost like communication. Then we saw them, the figures from the night before, emerging from the forest in broad daylight, no longer trying to hide their presence. They were hurting us, driving us towards some purpose we couldn't understand, and the horrible realization hit me that we might never make it home to Winnipeg. In desperation, I made the decision to drive straight through the figures blocking our path, reasoning that whatever they were, they couldn't be solid enough to stop a moving vehicle. Rebecca screamed as I floored the accelerator, but the van passed right through them like they were made of mist and shadow. For a moment, I thought we'd escaped, but then our engine died completely, leaving us coasting to a stop in the middle of the forest with no power and no way to restart the vehicle. The figures materialized around us again, closer than ever, and now I could see them clearly in the daylight. They were people, or had been people once, but something had happened to them that left them trapped between life and death. Their clothes were from different eras, spanning decades, and I realized we were looking at other travelers who had found this place and never left. The couple from the 1970s van were among them, still wearing the same outfits from their photographs, still trying to escape a prison they'd been locked in for almost 50 years. What happened next still doesn't make complete sense to me, even now. Rebecca suddenly got out of the van and started walking toward the figures, despite my shouting for her to stop. She moved with that same jerky, unnatural gait we'd observed the night before, and when she turned back to look at me, her expression was completely blank, like no one was home behind her eyes. "It's not so bad here, Garrett," she said in a voice that sounded like hers but felt completely wrong. "You get used to it. We have forever to figure it out." I don't remember much about my escape, just fragments of running through the forest, my van somehow starting up one final time, and driving like a madman until I reached the main highway. When I looked back, there was no access road anymore, just unbroken forest stretching to the horizon. The local police listened to my story with the kind of patient expressions reserved for people having mental breakdowns, and the search parties they sent out found no trace of Rebecca, our camping spot, or even the road we'd taken to get there. That was 6 months ago, and I still wake up every night hearing Rebecca's voice calling to me from somewhere far away, telling me she's waiting for me to come back and join her. The scary part is how appealing that sounds sometimes, especially during the long Winnipeg winters when the loneliness feels overwhelming. I've started planning another trip to Thunder Bay, telling myself I'm going to find her and bring her home. But deep down, I know that's not what will happen. Some mistakes you make once, and some places claim you forever. I'm writing this down in case anyone finds it after I disappear, so they'll know what really happened to us out there by that cursed lake. I'm going to tell you about the last time I ever went camping alone. It happened near Sudbury last fall, and I still can't explain what I experienced out there. I thought I was just dealing with some local punks trying to mess with a solo female traveler, but what started as harassment turned into something much worse. The mining history around that area runs deep, and apparently some things that went down into those old shafts never came back up the same way they went down. I'm Cassandra Burke, 37 years old, and I've been living in Toronto for the past 12 years, working as a freelance graphic designer. My van life journey started 3 years ago after a particularly nasty breakup left me questioning everything about my settled urban existence. My converted 2019 Ram ProMaster became my escape pod from the chaos of city life, and I'd gotten pretty comfortable with solo camping trips across Ontario. My best friend Maya Patel, who's 35 and works as a nurse practitioner, always worried about me traveling alone, but I'd never had any serious problems until this trip changed everything. I'd been planning this particular expedition for weeks, targeting the area around Sudbury specifically because of its unique geological features and mining history. As a designer, I'm always looking for interesting textures and landscapes to photograph for future projects, and the scarred, almost alien-looking terrain around the old nickel mines promised exactly the kind of dramatic imagery I was after. Maya had begged me to wait until she could take time off work to come with me, but my schedule was clearing up and the fall colors were at their peak. My van was well equipped for solo travel, solar panels, a diesel heater, emergency communication devices, and enough supplies to last a week without resupplying. I'd done my research on the area, finding a network of old logging roads that would let me get away from the main tourist routes and find the kind of isolated spots where I could park overnight without bothering anyone. The plan was simple: spend 4 days photographing the landscape, then head back to Toronto with a memory card full of unique content for my portfolio. The drive north from Toronto took about 4 hours, and I spent most of it listening to podcasts about the region's history. Sudbury's mining industry went back over a century, with networks of underground tunnels that stretched for miles beneath the surface. Some of the older mines had been abandoned for decades, their entrances sealed or simply forgotten as the forest slowly reclaimed the land. What struck me as particularly interesting and slightly disturbing was how many of the historical accounts mention miners who had gone missing in the deeper shafts, their bodies never recovered. I reached my planned camping area just as the sun was setting, following a barely maintained logging road deep into the forest until I found a clearing that looked perfect for an overnight stay. The spot was about 2 kilometers from the nearest sealed mine entrance, close enough to explore on foot the next morning, but far enough away to avoid any potential safety hazards. As I set up my evening routine, I felt that familiar sense of peace that comes with being completely alone in the wilderness. If I'd known what was waiting for me in those woods, I would have turned around and driven straight back to the city, but sometimes ignorance feels like bliss until it becomes horror. The first night passed without incident, but I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. My dreams had been filled with strange sounds, mechanical noises like mining equipment running somewhere far underground, mixed with voices calling out in what sounded like distress. I chalked it up to my subconscious processing all the mining history I'd been reading about, but the exhaustion felt real enough. My morning coffee tasted off, too, with a metallic flavor that reminded me unpleasantly of pennies or blood. Around mid-morning, I hiked to one of the sealed mine entrances to take some photographs. The concrete barrier blocking the shaft looked relatively new, but someone had been messing with it recently. Scratch marks around the edges, loose gravel scattered around the base, and what looked like fresh tool marks in the concrete. Local kids, probably, trying to get inside for thrills or dares. But the disturbing part was finding personal items scattered around the area. A woman's earring, a man's wallet with no identification inside, and a cell phone that looked like it had been exposed to the elements for months. That afternoon, while I was editing photos in my van, I started hearing ATVs in the distance. Not unusual for the area, but these riders seemed to be circling my location, getting closer with each pass. Eventually, I saw them, 3 men on quad bikes, probably in their 30s, wearing camouflage gear and bandanas over their faces. They stopped about 50 yards from my van and just sat there, engines idling, staring at me through my windows. When I waved, none of them responded. They just watched me for about 10 minutes, then rode off without saying a word. The encounter left me feeling uneasy, but I tried to rationalize it as curiosity about an outsider in their territory. Solo female travelers sometimes attract unwanted attention, and I dealt with similar situations before without anything escalating beyond uncomfortable staring. I made sure all my doors were locked and kept my bear spray within easy reach, standard precautions that had always been sufficient in the past. But something about these particular men felt different, more predatory, more patient, like they were sizing me up for something specific. As evening approached, I noticed changes in the forest around my campsite that made no logical sense. Trees that I'd photographed that morning seemed to be in different positions, and there were new paths through the underbrush that definitely hadn't been there before. Most disturbing of all, I found fresh footprints around my van, not boot prints from the ATV riders, but bare human feet with toes that seemed unnaturally long and spread too wide. The prints led from the tree line to my van's doors, then back into the forest, as if someone had been testing my security while I was away taking pictures. The scary realization hit me that I might not be alone out here, and whatever was sharing this space with me wasn't entirely human. The ATV riders returned just after sunset, but this time they weren't keeping their distance. They rode right up to my van, engines revving aggressively, and started circling me like predators cornering prey. I could hear them shouting over the noise, but their words were muffled by the bandanas and engine sounds. What I could make out sounded threatening, comments about women who traveled alone, suggestions about what they might do to teach me a lesson about respecting local territory. My hands were shaking as I reached for my emergency satellite communicator, but when I tried to activate the device, nothing happened. The screen remained blank despite showing full battery power that morning. My cell phone was the same, completely dead, even though it had been charging all day through my van's electrical system. Even my van's engine wouldn't start, just clicking sounds when I turned the key. I was trapped, defenseless, with 3 hostile strangers circling my home like wolves around a wounded animal. The scary part was how confident they seemed, like they'd done this before and knew exactly how to isolate their victims. That's when I noticed something that made the situation even more disturbing. The men's movements on their ATVs were becoming increasingly erratic and unnatural. They would accelerate toward my van as if planning to ram it, then swerve away at the last second with timing that seemed superhuman. Their shouts were changing too, becoming less like human speech and more like animal sounds, growls and howls that echoed through the forest in ways that didn't match the positions of their vehicles. When one of them finally dismounted and approached my van on foot, I could see his eyes reflecting light like an animal's. The man pressed his face against my driver's side window, and what I saw made me question my own sanity. His features were wrong: mouth too wide, teeth too sharp, skin that seemed to shift and crawl in the dim light from my interior lamps. When he spoke, his voice came from multiple directions at once, as if there were several versions of him surrounding my van. "Come out and play," he said, but the words didn't match the movement of his lips. "We've been waiting so long for someone new to join our games down in the deep places." The other 2 riders had vanished completely, but I could still hear their engines running somewhere in the forest, the sound moving in impossible patterns, sometimes underground, sometimes overhead in the trees, sometimes seeming to come from inside my own van. My rational mind was screaming that none of this could be real, that I must be having some kind of breakdown, but my survival instincts were telling me to run. When I looked toward the sealed mine entrance in the distance, I could see lights flickering deep inside, beyond where any lights should be able to penetrate. Something was down there, something that had been waiting in the darkness for new victims to stumble into its territory. And these weren't local troublemakers harassing a solo traveler. They were bait, lures, things that had once been human, but now served a much older and more hungry master. In desperation, I tried everything I could think of to get my van started, checking fuses, wiggling connections, even trying to jump-start it with my portable battery pack. Nothing worked, but I noticed that every time I made progress on diagnosing the problem, the man at my window would laugh and the sounds would get worse. It was like whatever was controlling this situation wanted me to struggle, wanted me to exhaust all my rational solutions before accepting the horrible truth about my circumstances. Finally, I made the terrifying decision to abandon my van and make a run for it on foot. I grabbed my emergency backpack, bear spray, and flashlight, then waited for a moment when the thing outside moved away from my door. The forest was my only chance. If I could reach the main logging road, maybe I could flag down another vehicle or at least put some distance between myself and whatever was hunting me. The scary part was leaving behind my shelter and all my supplies, but staying meant facing whatever those creatures had planned for me. The moment I stepped outside, the temperature dropped at least 20 degrees, and I could see my breath forming clouds in the suddenly frigid air. The man who had been at my window was nowhere to be seen, but I could hear all 3 ATVs running somewhere in the darkness around me, their engines creating a wall of sound that made it impossible to determine which direction was safe. My flashlight beam seemed weaker than it should be, barely penetrating the unnatural darkness that had settled over the forest like a living thing. I ran toward what I hoped was the logging road, crashing through underbrush and stumbling over roots in my panic to escape. Behind me, I could hear pursuit, not just the ATVs, but footsteps that sounded like dozens of people running through the forest, all moving with that same unnatural coordination I'd observed earlier. Voices called my name from multiple directions, some sounding like the ATV riders, others like people I'd never met, but who somehow knew intimate details about my life in Toronto, my work, my relationship with Maya. When I finally reached what should have been the logging road, I found myself standing at the edge of an enormous pit that definitely hadn't been there when I'd driven in the day before. The hole stretched down into darkness so complete that my flashlight couldn't find the bottom, and I could hear machinery running far below, mining equipment that should have been silent for decades. Carved into the walls of the pit were symbols that hurt to look at directly, and as I stood there trying to process what I was seeing, I realized the horrible truth. I hadn't been camping near an old mine site. I had been camping on top of something that was still very much active, something that had been waiting patiently for new victims to stumble into its hunting grounds, and my van life adventure had just become a one-way trip into the depths of the earth. What happened next is hard to explain in any rational way. The pit began to glow with a sickly green light that seemed to come from phosphorescent veins in the rock walls, and I could see movement down there. Figures climbing up toward me with impossible speed and agility. They weren't human, but they had been once, before whatever lived in the deepest parts of the mine had changed them into something else. The ATV riders were among them, but now I could see they were just the newest additions to an army of transformed victims that stretched back decades. I turned to run back toward my van, thinking that maybe I could lock myself inside and wait for dawn, but the forest had changed again. Paths led in directions that violated basic geography, and trees formed corridors that seemed to guide me inevitably back toward the pit. Every escape route I tried eventually curved around and delivered me to the same spot on the edge of that glowing chasm. The things climbing up from below were getting closer, and I could hear them calling to me in voices I recognized: Maya, my parents, co-workers from Toronto, all telling me how worried they were and how I should come down where it was safe. The last clear memory I have is making the decision to jump rather than let them take me alive. I remember the sensation of falling, the wind rushing past my face, and the growing realization that the pit was much deeper than it had appeared from the surface. But instead of hitting bottom and ending everything, I found myself floating, suspended in that green-lit darkness, while something vast and ancient examined me with interest. It spoke without words, communicating through images and emotions that conveyed its hunger, its loneliness, its desperate need for new servants to help it expand its territory beyond the confines of the old mining tunnels. When I woke up, I was back in my van, parked in the same clearing, with sunlight streaming through the windows and birds singing outside. My equipment worked perfectly. My van started on the first try, and there was no sign of the pit or the transformed creatures or anything else from that nightmare. I drove straight back to Toronto, convinced I'd had some kind of breakdown or reaction to bad water. But Maya noticed the changes immediately: how I'd lost weight, how my eyes had developed a reflective quality in dim light, how I couldn't stop talking about the mining tunnels beneath Sudbury. 3 months later, I'm planning my return trip. Not because I want to go back, but because something inside me needs to return to that place to complete whatever process was started that night. Maya thinks I'm having delayed PTSD from the trauma, and maybe she's right, but that doesn't change the compulsion I feel to pack my van and drive north again. Sometimes, late at night, I can hear mining equipment running beneath the streets of Toronto, and I know that whatever claimed me in those tunnels is expanding its territory, using people like me as scouts and recruiters. The scary part is how normal it all feels now, how right it seems to be preparing for another camping trip that I know will be my last journey as anything resembling human.